So good morning and good afternoon, as I said to everybody. We're here to talk about the Solar Dispatchability Challenge. And we have with us some really amazing expert speakers who are going to be giving us a full picture of different markets throughout the world, of how it works. So we have with us today Jean-Pascal Boutin from Eversheds, who is going to be talking about the British market. We have Marc Mejos from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, who is going to be talking about their research into the impact of CSP in the grid. We have Miguel de la Torre from Red Eléctrica de España, who is going to be talking about the Spanish market. And we have Graeme Sims from the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, who is going to be talking about how it works in the United Arab Emirates. This webinar has been organized by myself, by ATA Insights, and myself, Belén Gallego, with the collaboration of the Clean Energy Business Council. And before we start, just a very short welcome from Stefan, who's going to be dedicating a few words, and then we'll go right into the presentations. Stefan?
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Stéphane Legentil. I'm the CEO of the Clean Energy Business Council, and we are very pleased to bring to you today this webinar in collaboration with ATA Insights. Just one word about the CEBC. We are a non-profit, non-governmental organization dedicated to promote clean energy in the MENA region. We have around 100 members, and we do a lot of activities related to clean energy. I take the opportunity just to introduce the next one that is going to be on the 18th of September in Dubai on clean energy finance. So you'll find more information on our website. And with that, I think we have a very busy webinar coming, so I'll just pass back the mic to Belén. Thank you.
Yes, we do have a very packed hour, but it's going to be so interesting that I think it's going to go really quickly. So first, we're going to hear from Graeme on the situation in the United Arab Emirates and in Dubai. So without further ado, I'll just give you the stage. Graeme, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can share yours. So you can unsilence your microphone and share your screen with us. And just in the meanwhile, whilst Graeme starts preparing, I'd just like to remind you just a couple of things. You can send us questions in the little box at the bottom. There is like a toolbar at the bottom. There is a Q&A questions there. You can just send whatever comes to mind, and then we'll have a go to answer as many as we can at the end once the 4 presentations are over. So just anytime, just send them there, okay? And we will share all of the presentations and the recordings with you guys. It'll be with you in the next couple of days. So Graeme, go for it.
Thanks very much. I hope you can all see the screen, and good afternoon from me. As Belén was saying, we have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to go through these slides really quite rapidly, but there should be time for questions at the end. So here's what I plan to cover, and I won't tell you what that is, but you can see it on the screen. We're the regulatory body for the power and water sector in Dubai, established about 7 years ago, but really operational for about the last 5 years. And our core role has been to license the new entrants to Dubai's power system. And we have other responsibilities, which are more on the demand side management side of things. Just to give you an idea about Dubai, it's I guess a medium-sized power system. Peak demand last year was about 8 gigawatts. There's a fairly healthy surplus of capacity over demand, about 43 terawatt hours of consumption. And perhaps the key point is that the great bulk of that consumption is residential and commercial. There's only a relatively small industrial sector in Dubai. So most of that electricity is consumed in buildings, and most of what is consumed in buildings out here is consumed in keeping those buildings cool, given the nature of the climate. I guess what that means is there's a pretty high correlation between solar output and electricity demand on this system, which is not the case everywhere. In terms of solar in Dubai, there was a comprehensive study done about 5 years ago, which looked at what was the hosting capability for solar in Dubai. Purely from a physical point of view, there is plenty of scope to install solar panels. Purely within the urban landscape, you could install something like 49 gigawatts of panels if you were to put them wherever they could be easily applied on rooftops. And that's, as we've seen, that's something like 6 times current peak demand. At that time, there was quite a modest target, which was to have around 5% of total peak demand met by renewables by 2030, despite the fact there was this great, this far higher hosting capacity. But as we've seen costs change for solar PV in particular, that target has been adjusted, and the current target is for there to be 21% of capacity in 2030 provided by solar, with a 4-to-1 ratio of PV and CSP. We have a rooftop market, and that operates on the basis of a net metering scheme. That's just been going a couple of years and made some fairly modest contributions. Just around 16 megawatts has been connected so far. But in terms of the larger schemes, you can see on the left-hand side what's currently planned for the system here in Dubai. So the first large-scale utility PV scheme was tendered back in 2015 and was commissioned this year, and that's a 200 megawatt scheme. And at the time, that had a levelized cost of electricity of something like 6 US cents per kilowatt hour, which was seen as a world best for utility scale solar. Just 1 year later, when there was a tender put out for 800 megawatts of PV, which is to be commissioned by 2020, the price had halved. So we're down to 3 US cents per kilowatt hour. And that figure is half what the consultants who were originally studying the solar market in Dubai estimated would be the cost of PV in 2030, which really underlines the extent to which costs have moved far more rapidly than anyone really expected. And most recently, there's been the first CSP scheme for Dubai, and that's a CSP scheme with storage. So it's designed to operate off-peak, outside of the sunshine hours. And for CSP, that came in at a very competitive price of around 9 US cents per kilowatt hour. Now, in terms of the challenges here in Dubai and to some extent elsewhere, this is a very stylized representation of what the low duration curve might look like. So the top line is the classic curve. And then the green line shows how that curve might change if you had solar PV, which was 100% of peak demand. So in other words, you could meet the peak purely with solar PV. Now, whilst that changes the shape of the curve quite a lot, the reality is you still have to meet 80% of the peak, because there are still periods of the day, particularly just after sunset, when demand is still high because of the temperature and lighting starts to be required. And meeting 100% of peak demand through solar means you still have to meet something like 70% of the total energy requirements on the system, because the load factor of solar is relatively modest. So simply in terms of meeting demand and energy requirements securely, even with very high penetration of solar, there's still a very substantial need. And more than that, the nature of system operation changes quite a lot, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that from our colleagues at Red Electrica shortly. But very, very briefly, you have much less synchronous generation on the system, lower system inertia, which makes frequency regulation more complicated. Voltage regulation becomes more challenging, particularly if you have high volumes of distributed generation, because then demand on the transmission system can become quite low. You can have much higher ramp rates as demand and output will change more rapidly than they do in a conventional system. Great example of that would be what happened during the solar eclipse in California a couple of weeks back, where hundreds and hundreds of megawatts were being lost very quickly as the solar eclipse developed. And if you're a transmission operator, much less of the generation on the system is visible to you than it used to be. You simply don't know exactly what's out there if it's particularly if it's connected at distribution level. So those are the challenges faced here, but the challenges faced more generally, I think. And in terms of the solutions to those, again, we'll hear a bit more later about how successful battery technology has already been in the markets for energy storage and fast frequency response. And here there's a plan to have installed something like 1,000 megawatts of battery capacity by the 2030s. We're also looking at what are called green peakers. So in other words, providing non-fossil based turbine or engine-based solutions to meet the peak. Pump storage is being deployed extensively in other countries, and you might surprise you to hear that Dubai is developing a hydro scheme, but there's a plan for a 250 megawatt hydro scheme in the more mountainous parts of Dubai. Interconnection is likely to play a big part. There are existing interconnections throughout the GCC, but probably much more scope to use those. And there are non-electricity solutions. So we produce virtually all of our water here through desalination. Currently that's thermal, but it's almost certain to become reverse osmosis in future. And that fits quite well with the profile of solar output, because water demand is more constant through the year, whereas electricity demand tends to reduce in the winter. And we also have options to use things like thermal energy storage in cooling systems. So in other words, that's making very cold water or even ice, which can then be released into cooling systems when it's needed. And the sort of penultimate point I put on there, which I think is a bit more of a question, is the role that EVs might play. I mean, I think they have possibly a rather mixed impact on the electricity system. They potentially will increase demand. At a domestic level, they can involve very high power requirements compared to what's traditionally placed on domestic systems. But on the other hand, they do potentially represent a huge amount of storage, which at times will be connected into the grid. So that's all I was going to say. I appreciate that's been very quick, but I'm happy to answer questions later on. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Graham. Thank you very much. And you've been right on time. So one of my favorites today so far. Okay, so next up, Miguel, maybe you can unsilence your microphone and share the screen with us. We're going to hear from Miguel, the case in Spain, and you've already been sending some questions, but feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. Excellent. Perfect. Just make it large.
Okay. So good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Well, my name is Miguel de la Torre, and I work for the Control Center Department in Red Eléctrica de España, which is the Spanish TSO. And today I will be giving some hints on the integration of solar power and its interaction with storage in Spain in order to give that dispatchability that's needed. Well, short introduction to the Spanish electricity system. So REE is the only Spanish TSO, and it owns almost all the transmission grid. I'm going to talk about the peninsular system, which is the largest system in Spain, basically the part in the Iberian Peninsula, but there are other island systems as well. It's a system about the peak demand. It's about 45,000 megawatts, so relatively large for European standards. However, it is interconnected with the European continental system, which is one of the largest synchronous systems in the world, and so we have very little frequency changes, but we do have. So one of the things that we need to keep an eye on is the balancing of the Spanish peninsula. And well, the transmission system is composed of 400 and 220 kV lines. Just about the present installed capacity, where we are right now. Wind is right now the second technology in terms of installed capacity with 23 gigawatts. That's just a couple of thousand megawatts below combined cycle gas-fired units. As you can see, the mix is it's quite shared between different technologies, and it is so hydropower is also one of the main technologies, of which accounting around 20,000 megawatts, of which more than 5,000 megawatts is of pump storage units. If we talk now about generated electricity in 2016, the technology with the largest share is nuclear generation with about 23%. Then comes wind with 20%. Wind has been steady at the last years at around 20%. And then solar, the installed capacity in solar PV is around 4.4 gigawatts, so much less than other countries in Europe like Italy or Germany. It accounts for 3% of the total energy around these years. And also in Spain, there's quite a bit of solar thermal or solar CSP technology, around 2.3 gigawatts, which accounts for around 2% of the accumulated net generation in 2016. So basically, the biggest challenge of integrating variable renewables, so basically wind and solar, is how the generation profiles actually adds up to meeting the demand. In terms, so wind generation is, we say it's a little bit more chaotic. It doesn't have very definite patterns. It does have some in summer where the wind production is relatively, it's much higher during the evening hours, and then it goes down through the night, and it's lower during the early morning hours, and then it picks up again. But only in summer. In winter, it depends on the weather systems that come and go through the Iberian Peninsula. Photovoltaic, it's it produces not, of course, during the middle hours of the day, and depending whether you are in summer or in winter, so that the production hump just widens or closes down. You can see also how the added solar thermal generation adds up in a clear day in Spain, and as you can see, there are some difference in the shape of production between the solar PV and the solar CSP. Mainly due to, well, the higher thermal inertia of the solar CSP, but also around 40% of the installed capacity in solar CSP in Spain have molten salt storage, so they have some kind of thermal storage, and therefore they are able to produce also during the evening hours of the day if there has been good sun, and even some plants are able to produce 24 hours straight, especially in the summer. Basically, the difference between, or basically the net demand is compensated by non-nuclear thermal, hydro, and pump storage power plants, and very importantly, also in Spain, the international exchange programs, as there's quite a bit of interconnection capacity, mainly with Portugal, but also some with France. And well, that depends on basically the production units depend on the wholesale market prices. I would like to focus now a little bit more on the regulatory and the operational considerations for solar power. The regulation right now in Spain doesn't differ much between conventional and renewable energy sources. So that means that solar generation participates in the wholesale markets just as any other type of generation, and it also pays for its deviations when the final production is not the same as was scheduled. So about observability, we do observe, so we do have real-time telemeasurements of plants with an installed capacity larger than 1 megawatt. So we are able to know at every time how much solar generation with quite high accuracy there is in the system, and we use that information also to feed our forecasting tools. And also, if the plants are larger than 5 megawatts, they also have to attend the real-time limitations that may be issued by REE due to, for example, congestion management. We believe that real-time information and that use of that information in forecasting tools is actually essential to maintain a proper balancing in the system, which is one of our main worries, and of course at relatively low balancing costs. Any uncertainties in the generation forecasting at the end account, they have negative consequences for the producers because they have to pay these deviation payments, but also for the consumers as they will have to pay higher reserve, so-called or running reserve costs. Also, in Spain, solar plants are able to participate also as providers in balancing services. So they could participate, for example, in secondary regulation, in competition with any other generation mean. However, in solar generation, the participation is negligible almost. Unlike wind, more or less half of the wind is actually participating in the tertiary reserve market right now. And just to say, regarding the variability of the solar power in our system, the maximum variability comes at dawn and dusk, so since the plants are quite well geographically spread, the effect of clouds coming in single plants is almost negligible. I would also like to point out the role of storage in the Spanish electricity system. Basically, the main use is the shifting of the generation from hours with lower marginal prices to hours with higher marginal prices. And of course, if there are some hours with high renewable energy and low demand, the prices will be low, and therefore the storage companies will buy energy at those hours to shift the production to other hours. It also provides, it's one of the main providers of balancing services, also voltage control, and provides also congestion management services. Also very important, so normally pump storage power plants can be shifted within 15 minutes. So it provides very fast cold reserves if there is water, of course, in the upper reservoir. And that is good to counteract the possible variations, and especially if there are extreme events that can happen or large imbalances due to any type of reason, for example, the tripping of a nuclear power plant. Also, pump storage provides inertia, which is one of the issues that in the future may arise, not today with renewable energy penetration right now, but in the future this can be an issue. Storage also allows balance responsible parties who own pumped storage units to mitigate their deviations and not have to pay for them. And we believe in NREL that the role of storage is more relevant when this storage attends the needs of the whole system, so that, for example, it provides these balancing services, and not when this storage is completely coupled to the needs of a single power plant of group of plants. So basically, because you might have some plants that are deviating in one direction and others in other direction. So we think it is a better role for storage to actually see the needs of the system as a whole. And just to finish, storage basically is one of the instruments for integration of variable renewable, but there are others. In Spain, the reinforcement of international interconnections and the possibility to have almost the same prices in European internal markets. It's one of the main drivers also for integration of variable renewable energy. Also very important for us is to have control instruments to be able to assure that we have control of the system at all times, even in very degraded situations. It's important that the legislation promotes also ancillary services provision with renewables, and that this legislation is also coherent with the technological possibilities. And also very importantly, and one of the main works right now going on in Europe is to have a relatively harmonized Europe-wide regulation, like the recently published network codes and guidelines that apply for all of the TSOs in Europe. And well, that was more or less what I wanted to share with you, and I hope it was of interest, and I will be open for questions afterwards. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Miguel. This was very interesting to hear from the Spanish grid. You guys have so many different types of sources. So next, we're gonna give the floor, if you can just stop sharing there and silence your mic. Mark, it's your turn. You know how to share the screen?
Yep.
And a special shout out to Mark, who's waken up really, really, really early because he's based in Denver to be here with us today. Bravo.
Thank you, Belen, and good morning to everybody. Here in the US, it's about 4:30 in the morning. Good afternoon, everybody else. So I'm going to talk about NREL's research looking at the value of CSP with dispatchable thermal energy storage. And Belen, I'm not able to control. There we are. Okay, just so everybody knows, I am from the US. I'm from Colorado, which is in the central US. I work for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's the one laboratory out of a number of laboratories in the DOE system that's devoted exclusively to renewable energy. And as part of that, we do quite a bit of work on looking at dispatchability of PV systems, wind systems, and CSP with thermal energy storage, which I'll talk about. So the summary of my discussion: CSP with thermal storage provides and maintains both operational benefits, and that's fuel and emissions, I'll go into in more detail in a little bit, and capacity benefits, that's reliability on the system. This becomes even more true at high penetrations of variable renewable technologies, and when we talk about variable technologies, usually we're talking about PV and wind energy. And later in the discussion, I may not have time to get to this, CSP can support additional generation of variable technologies due to the flexibility that CSP provides and its ability to turn down generation during peak load periods. So our work at NREL focuses on the US Western Interconnect, which is basically the West US and the high solar resources in the Southwest US, which includes one of our major markets and load regions, which is the California Independent System Operating Balancing Area. So we use a model called Plexos. It's a commercial economic dispatch tool that we use for looking at dispatch of CSP with thermal storage along with the rest of the system. And it's a fairly high resolution model, again, focusing in this case on the WEC region and the Cal ISO. Why are we interested in the Cal ISO and renewables at high penetrations? Most of you have probably heard about what we call the duck curve, where at higher and higher penetrations of, in this case, solar on the grid, we get a higher and higher belly of the duck, which represents high levels of PV on the system. What we see is, as was alluded to earlier, high ramp rates later in the day and a peak that occurs late in the evening when essentially PV cannot dispatch to meet that peak. And so we look at the ability of CSP with storage to meet that peak. So there's two benefits that CSP provides. One is the operational benefit, the other is the capacity benefit. Here we are looking at the operational value, and we're looking at two variables. What is the amount of thermal energy storage on the system? And the second one is what is the solar multiple for CSP, the CSP configuration. When I talk about the solar multiple is the size of the solar field relative to the size of the turbine. The higher the solar multiple, the higher the capacity factor of my CSP plant. So a low solar multiple is more representative of a peaker plant. A high solar multiple approaching 2.7 or higher is representative of a baseload plant. And what you can see here is that as a low solar multiple plant, once I start adding storage, I get a very high operational value. The higher my solar multiple, the higher my capacity factor, but the lower the value supplied to the grid. And when we talk about operational value, we're really looking at the ability of the CSP plant to displace fuel on the system, to displace emissions if there are carbon taxes on the system, to reduce startups and shutdowns of other plants on the systems, for example, combustion turbines, or to reduce the variable O&M on those combustion turbines or combined cycle plants or baseload plants on the system. So the point here is that low solar multiple provides high operational value. The other value that CSP provides is reliability on the grid. And in California, at least a few years ago, we were looking at a renewable portfolio standard, a penetration of renewables on the grid in 2040 of 40%. Of course, that has increased to 50%, and we're likely to see scenarios approaching 80% or higher by 2050. But at the 40% renewable portfolio standard, representing about 15% PV on the grid, what we see is the capacity credit, and that is the ability of a system to eliminate the need for a peaking system like a combustion turbine. The capacity credit of CSP remains relatively high, approaching 100% capacity credit, while the PV on the system approaches a capacity credit of about 3.4%. So very low, because at this point the profile of the PV on the system has very little ability to meet that net peak load that happens late in the evening at these high penetrations. So when you roll these together, you can look at the value provided for both CSP and PV compared to each other. And what we see is, especially due to that low capacity credit offered by PV and the high capacity credit offered by CSP, that a CSP system offers about $40 to $50 per megawatt hour higher value than a equivalent PV on that system at those high levels of penetrations. So the other side of the equation, of course, is what's the cost difference? And we heard earlier we have PV approaching costs of 3 cents or lower. CSP, we heard in Dubai, has a bid of around 9 cents, but we're also hearing bids approaching 6 cents in some high resource areas. And so we don't know where CSP is going, but we know it's going below 9 cents and we know it's approaching 6 cents. So the information that I gave you can be looked at in a number of reports. I think this presentation will be provided, but if you look up authors Paul Denholm, Jenny Jorgensen, or myself, keywords concentrating solar power on this site, you can find that report. I won't talk about this, but there's another report looking at CSP as an enabler of higher levels of penetration of PV due to the flexibility that CSP provides, and you can also find that on that website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So it was great to hear the CSP could enable more renewable energy. If you want to take just your presentation off, and we will allow for the last presentation, I have to say I'm very proud of you all. You're doing very well with time. So Jean-Pascal, if you want to just share it with us. Actually, you're going to have to go to display settings for us, and at the top in the center. Just to make sure that it's larger, Jean-Pascal, because at the moment it's very small, we can't see it. So if you go to display settings, it's like in the toolbar at the top is show taskbar, display settings is the second option.
Sorry, say that again. It's the second option.
Display settings at the top.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I think
optimize. Is that it?
Nope. One of the options should have full screen, no? Maybe try again. Just share the screen again with because we're even seeing a little bit pixelated. Technical issues, eh? You always get some. Here we go. I'm sure this one will work. Okay, just try to make it larger. You know, I think we can read it because it's big. We can see it like 2 screens instead of 1, but if you try and make it larger. No, neither of those. Okay, well. That's okay. Just let's go for it. And we'll just make sure that the presentation goes to everybody. You have to make sure you have it open, and then you share the screen. So, in the meanwhile, we're having some really interesting questions here. Yeah, there you go. Yes, if you make it larger, that would be perfect. We're having some really interesting questions arriving, actually. Keep them coming. I know some of our speakers are replying to them by text. We only see a little bit of your screen now, Jean-Pascal. Sorry to be such a nuisance.
Is that better?
Perfect. Yay. Perfect.
Yay, got there at the end. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to speak to you all today. Just an introduction about Evershed Sutherland. We're an international law firm. We have over 100 lawyers specializing in renewable energy and storage. And we have offices all around the world, including the US, the Middle East, and Europe. So I'm just going to look at it a slightly different slant. I'm going to look at essentially the different, the impact of solar and wind and other renewable technologies in terms of balancing the network and the storage requirements of those technologies. So the way I split this presentation up is there's 3 different types of customer base, which will have an impact on the type of storage used and the co-location or the interface between those customers and solar and wind. So looking at a grid operator of any country in the world, the key drivers of storage in that country are decarbonization, the balancing of intermittent renewable energy, also deferring network upgrades, investments, and also, as we touched on earlier, is changes in demand profile. So, for example, the introduction of electric vehicles. Essentially, we see two main types of storage technologies. One is relating to what we call response systems. So those are rapid or instantaneous power for short periods of time, or reserve systems. So those are a slow ramp-up time, but potentially at a larger scale. So just to give you an examples of how we've seen this, so looking at the National Grid, which is a transmission operator in the UK, they award multiple types of contracts. So the first are types of frequency stability, and they're looking for response times of 1 to 30 seconds with a up to 30-minute discharge time. And also we have what's called fast reserve contracts, and that's looking at dealing with sudden demand, increases in demand or generation loss. So for example, the solar eclipse example would be a good example of that. And there the response time is 2 minutes with 5 to 15-minute discharge. So those first two elements lend themselves very much to what we would, to battery storage, and in particular moving forward lithium ion. Then we've got short-term operating reserve, which is again dealing with changes in demand, and there it's a 20-minute response time with a 2-hour discharge period. So there it's more open to competition as a mixture of battery storage, but also potentially gas and diesel generators. And lastly, in the UK, I think we're one of the few areas of the world, and Germany also have what we call the capacity market, and that is to ensure that there is sufficient baseload capacity on the system. So this is a mechanism to ensure that that existing capacity is preserved and also encouraging new capacity. And again, this is to offset the intermittency of solar and wind. So there we've got response time of 4 hours, and the discharge period is usually between 2 to 4 hours. Recently in the UK, well, there was a tender in 2015 with the results announced last year, and it was what we called an enhanced frequency response tender. And there the requirement was 100% of active power output within at least 1 second of a change in frequency deviation, with up to 30 minutes dispatch. There were multiple bids, and this was for up to 200 megawatts. 8 bids were successful, ranging from capacity of 10 to 49 megawatts, and there the price was ranging from 7 megawatts per hour to 12 megawatts per hour, essentially depending on the size of the facility. All the technologies proposed in that case were lithium-ion batteries. Just examples of other markets where we've seen tenders. Recently, Jordan, there's a 12 megawatt lithium-ion battery awarded. That's Philadelphia Solar, and that was a contract with Ideco, which is a distribution company. It will be co-located with Ideco's PV plant, and essentially that is to ensure there's a peak shaving capability and to increase stability on the grid network, and also enhance the output of the PV. And then the market that are about to instigate, in particular storage tenders, is EirGrid in Ireland. And there the prime purpose is to ensure that the grid network is stable enough to cater for increased levels of renewable energy. We also have large-scale storage, which is looking at a different space again. This has been traditional space for pumped hydro. As batteries become more on stream, especially lithium-ion, and become modular, there's a potential for batteries to also fill in the space. Also, we have compressed air energy storage, so just compressed air in underground chambers. And a prime example of that is the recent tender in Northern Ireland, where they use salt caverns, and that was 330 megawatts. So we've looked at the grid operator driving the requirements for different storage to compensate essentially for solar and wind. But we also have generators going out to tender for storage, and that's predominantly where they want storage to co-locate with wind or PV facilities. And essentially the prime reason for that is to ensure that during periods of peak, well, they can store the energy during peak generation periods. So for example, wind overnight, when there's low demand, they can store the energy to enable them to supply that energy during the daytime. It's also used where there's grid curtailment, there's not enough capacity on the grid network, or it's too expensive to reinforce the grid network. So we've seen that in islands and remote locations. For example, Saudi Arabia, we're looking at an off-grid solution, replacing diesel plants with PV and storage. So here, essentially, the battery or the storage characteristics are very much driven by the interface requirements of the on-site generation. And we've just seen Vestas and Tesla forming a working group to better work out how to interface Tesla batteries with Vestas wind turbines in that respect. And also there's requirements of off-takers and the grid requirements. So lastly, there's looking at end user support. So this is looking at where the end user has existing on-site generation. A number of end users have, especially in the Middle East and Africa, have diesel plants where the grid isn't stable. So now we're seeing end users exchanging their diesel plants for battery storage. And especially if they've got existing PV or wind, then the storage, the batteries will enable them to match the supply of the electricity with their demand profile. And as stated earlier, if they're off-grid, then this obviously combining PV with storage provides the ideal solution. Another use of storage by end users is where there is a variable import tariff. For example, in the UK, during peak times, it's very expensive to import electricity. So you would use storage to avoid importing at peak times and potentially export at those times. So again, the storage solutions would very much depend on interfacing on-site generation, ensuring that the storage meets the customer's demand characteristics and profile, and to the extent they're exporting, meeting the requirements of the grid operator. So that was a very high overview of how different customer demands are impacting on the interface storage with PV and wind. If I hand over back to Belen for I think the Q&A session.
Yeah, Q&A, but actually it's been going for a while. Thank you very much for all of you guys for actually answering the questions. A lot of the questions have already been answered, and that's awesome. I've seen that some of you have marked that you want to answer live. So I guess I would like to ask a question for all of you, whomever wants to answer, whether in terms of business model we're seeing a clear path as to who is going to provide that storage ability to the grid. Is it going to be the grid tendering it? Is it going to be the developers having to take ownership for the way that their power is dispatched? How do you see this panning out in the next few years? Is it different in different countries, or are we all going to tend to using the same process? Because it's going to depend on who's going to end up taking the decisions over what storage systems we use or what grid regulations we use. So I don't know if anyone wants to take this question. And then from them, we don't have a lot of time, so I would encourage each of you, obviously you've been answering questions, to maybe make a comment on, you know, what the questions that you're seeing repeating themselves. And Miguel, you have one mark you would like to answer live, so you can go for that. So first, really, in terms of business model, how it's going to work in your opinion, and then, you know, we'll take it from there, answering the questions you want to answer live.
So I can start if you'd like. So regarding the business model, this is going to depend on the mainly on the regulatory framework. So the case in Spain and in most of Europe. So at the end, the decision of investing in storage is going to come from it's a liberalized market, and it will come from the revenues that are expected to be made in the next many years. Regarding the difference between peak and off-peak prices, and what is the value of the cost of the balancing services, which is another could be another source of revenue. And regarding a specific question, there was a question about how much. So the PV plants in Spain, how when they are limited by us, by REE, how long do they have to attend this limitation? And that's within 15 minutes. So when they receive a limit, they have 15 minutes to comply with that limit, and that's all. Thank you very much.
That was quick. Well done. Okay, who wants to take next?
I can jump in. So just in a question as to what will drive storage, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think it will be the grid operator to the extent there is a liberalized market, and also to the extent that there is a good coverage of the country. But I think in countries, especially in Africa, where the grid network doesn't cover large sections of the country, then I think it's down to individual developers to combine, off-grid solutions, PV with storage. So I think it does depend on the extent of the grid network and the liberalized market.
Okay, and you looked at a bunch of different countries, so we'll see how it pans out. I just think it's a great opportunity for people to jump in, but to what extent, Graham, do you want to take it next?
Yeah, I think where you're talking about a grid operator who has a need to maintain the sort of integrity of the system, and so you're talking about some of these more exotic aspects of. So this isn't just providing capacity or energy. This is providing frequency, voltage regulation, so on. Then they're almost certainly going to have to do that by way of contract, the way they contract for other types of ancillary service, or really have done for you go back to the early 90s, I guess, in terms of the first markets that were liberalized. But that you can't stop people who have their own distributed power deciding that it makes sense for them to install their own storage because they want to take advantage of the pricing of power. So I think you'll probably see a bit of a mix at the distribution level. It may be people who want to self-generate, and self-generating with storage becomes the most economic thing to do given the prices that they face. Either they don't get paid very much for their export if they're exporting, or they have to pay a lot when they have to import. And then at the grid level, it's going to be the TSO, I think, who's the only person who can take that overall view of what the system's needs are.
And last but not least, Mark, you have also a bunch of questions, so you may want to talk a little bit about the things that have come up. You even have one still waiting for you.
I didn't look at the last one waiting for me. One of the questions that I've seen, and we're starting to see with CSP, is hybridization, and hybridization not in the classic sense of hybrid with natural gas, but hybridization with PV as an example. We're seeing tenders on hybridization in Morocco, for example. The nice thing about hybridization is that, and this was a question that was asked, what are the benefits? And the benefit of hybridization is probably geared mostly towards reducing project development costs, perhaps reducing infrastructure costs tying into the same grid interconnect, maybe reducing or benefiting control of the system, definitely overall reducing the LCOE of a hybrid PV CSP system. So we're seeing that Morocco has a tender for the northern Noor plants, Medets, where we're seeing specific requests for PV CSP hybrids. I'm also seeing that in China, and we're seeing bids, Solar Reserve, for example, for hybrid plants in Chile. So I think there's a trend there, and I think it's a trend that makes some economic sense. I don't think it'll be the exclusive path forward, but we're seeing that.
Thank you very much. And just last, because we have very little time, and I said to everybody, I'll be 50 minutes, and now we're going just over. But just There is a question here about industrial players, which I think is very important. And I mean, it's not in every single market that industrial players play a big role, but I mean, they have the ability, you know, many times or more often than not to like commission their own power. And could they be big players in terms of energy storage? You know, we're talking about big industrial players of like tens of megawatts. You know, can they drive down? Can they become sort of like players in the system? And I'm going to ask all of these guys to you. I guess the grid guys, I want to hear from you what are you thinking in terms of this, and then we'll leave it there, you know, because I know there's a few more questions, but and you know, they're all important. We don't have the time. So who wants to, you know,
okay,
give an opinion?
I'll say something about that first. I mean, I think the idea of getting the demand side and large users to participate in the market has been around for a long time. I think expecting them to respond in the sorts of timescales and with the sort of lack of predictability that you've got for intermittent renewables is, I mean, I'm not an expert on industrial processes, but I think you'd have to have, you know, an extremely flexible industrial process to be able to do that. And just looking at what's happening now in the UK, for instance, where they've essentially tendered for those types of services, which could come from the demand side. And what we've seen is the batteries are winning out. So I think for extremely fast response in the face of the sort of ramp rates that you're seeing in these systems, I'd be surprised if industrial users were really able to play a big role, but I might be missing something.
Any further opinions?
Well, I just touch on UK market. What we are seeing is the industry's essentially being a bit clever about how they use the energy. So as I explained there, a number of them are avoiding importing electricity at peak times. So they're doing that by installing, you know, diesel or gas or storage to avoid importing at peak times. To the extent that it's having a detrimental effect on paying for the cost of the transmission system and the cost of running in the transmission network. So it's one of the things that the regulator's looking at. So is in essence, some industrials are being too clever and too successful in playing the market, as it were, and it's having an adverse consequence that none of us foresaw, namely, they're not paying for the cost of the transmission network.
Excellent. So Miguel or Mark, before we just call it a day?
So in Spain, so large customers, so normally they are already they adapt their profile to prices, not only wholesale prices but also the tariff prices that they have to pay on top of them. And for example, there are some schemes in which they can participate, like the interruptible load schemes, which has a very low number of activations every year. But to participate in this market, they need to consume a certain percentage of their consumption during off-peak hours, and that shapes a little bit or quite a bit already how the industrial consumers behave in the system, and helps a lot also shifting demand from peak times to off-peak times.
Perfect. Mark.
So I was answering the other question. So what is this question?
Okay, gotcha. We just wanted to see, like, or to hear your opinion as to, you know, what's the role of industrial players? So, like, the tens, you know, of megawatts. Do they have a role to play? That's what we were discussing.
Well, I can't speak towards battery. I'll speak towards CSP, and CSP is already built in the hundreds of megawatt hours, hundreds of megawatts capacity. As far as industrial players in CSP, it's relatively small, and we see just a handful of players bidding internationally in all the markets that I described earlier.
So that's it. Like actually we managed to get to 55 past. So this has been 55 minutes. Thank you very much to all of you guys. Graham, thank you very much for your time. Jean-Pascal, Miguel, and Mark. It's been great having you here, for all the effort and for all your expertise, and also to everybody that's attended. There are people from more than 50 different countries. And yeah, I really appreciate your time. Hope we all learned something, and we'll see you in the next time. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.